Hey guys, happy Friday. I realized it might be helpful for you if I reference what the day is, even though you're welcome to do a bunch of these in a chunk if you want to. I still wanted to make sure that I'm referencing the day of the week. It'll make it easier for you to keep the videos in order. Though it doesn't necessarily matter what order you do them in. Just make sure for each video that you're doing a diary entry for you should have 5 total diary entries by the end of the week. So today we're kind of talking about, what sort of happens when people are stuck together for extended periods of time. And you guys all know that because you've experienced it too, probably even before this whole shelter in place deal. But we're going to talk a little bit today about some of the conflicts between the Van Dans, who argued a lot, conflicts between Anne and the Van Dans, and then probably one of the biggest conflicts in the book, which is between Anne and her mother. She and her mother constantly struggle throughout the book. So we're going to start on Wednesday, September 2nd, let me try that again. Wednesday, September 2nd, 1942. Dear Kitty, Mr. and Mrs. Van Daan have had a terrific quarrel. I've never seen anything quite like it before. Mommy and Daddy would never dream of shouting at each other. The cause was so trivial that the whole thing was a pure waste of breath, but still, everyone to his own liking. Naturally, it is very unpleasant for Peter, who has to stand by. No one takes him seriously. He is so frightfully touchy and lazy. Yesterday, he was badly upset because he found that his tongue was blue instead of red. This unusual phenomenon of nature disappeared just as quickly as it had come. Today, he's going about with a scarf on. As he has a stiff neck. In addition, my lord complains of lumbago. Pains under his heart and kidneys and lungs are not unusual either. He's a real hypochondria. That's the word for such people, isn't it? It is not all honey between Mummy and Mrs. Van Daan. There is plenty of cause for unpleasantness. To give a small example, I'll tell you that Mrs. Van Daan has taken all 3 of her sheets out of the common linen cupboard. She takes it for granted that Mummy's sheets will do for all of us. It will be a nasty surprise for her when she finds that Mummy has followed her good example. Also, she is thoroughly piqued that her dinner service is in use, not ours. She is always trying to find out where we have actually put our plates. They are closer than she thinks. They're in a cardboard box behind a lot of junk in the attic. Our plates are ungettable as long as we are here, and it's a good thing, too. I will always have bad luck. I smashed one of Mrs. Van Daan's soup plates into 1,000 pieces yesterday. Oh, she cried angrily. Couldn't you be careful for just once? That's the last one I've got. Mr. Van Daan is all sugar to me nowadays. Long may it last. Mommy gave me another frightful sermon this morning. I can't bear them. Our ideas are completely opposite. Daddy is a darling, although he can sometimes be angry with me for 5 full minutes on end. Yours, Anne. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here to Sunday, September 27th, 1942. Dear Kitty, just had a big bust-up with Mummy for the umpteenth time. We simply don't get on together these days, and Margot and I don't hit it off either any too well. As a rule, we don't go in for such outbursts, as this is in our family. Still, it is by no means always pleasant for me. Margot's and Mommy's natures are completely strange to me. I can understand my friends better than my own mother. Too bad. We often discuss post-war problems. For example, how one ought to address servants. Mrs. Van Daan had another tantrum. She is terribly moody. She keeps hiding more of her private belongings. Mommy ought to answer each Van Daan's disappearance with a frank disappearance. How some people do adore bringing up other people's children in addition to their own. The Van Daans are that kind. Margot doesn't need it. She is such a goody-goody, perfection itself, but I seem to have enough mischief in me for 2 of us put together. You should hear us at mealtimes, with reprimands and cheeky answers flying to and fro, Mommy and Daddy always defending me stoutly. I'd have to give up if it weren't for them, although they do tell me that I mustn't talk so much, and that I must be more retiring, and not poke my nose into everything. Still, I seem doomed to failure. If Daddy wasn't so patient, I'd be afraid that I was going to turn out to be a terrific disappointment to my parents, and they are pretty lenient with me. If I take a small helping of some vegetable I detest and make it up with potatoes, the Van Dans can't get over it, and any child should be so spoiled. Come along, Anne. Have a few more vegetables, she says straight away. No, thank you, Mrs. Van Daan, I answer. I have plenty of potatoes. Vegetables are good for you. Your mother says so, too. Have some more, she says, pressing them on me until Daddy comes to my rescue. Then we have from Mrs. Van Daan, you ought to have been in our house. We were properly brought up. It's absurd that Anne is so frightfully spoiled. I wouldn't put up with it if Anne were my daughter. These are always her first and last words. If Anne were my daughter. Thank heavens I'm not. But to come back to this upbringing business. There was a deadly silence after Mrs. Van Daan had finished speaking yesterday. Then Daddy said, I think Anne is extremely well brought up. She has learned one thing anyway, and that is to make no reply to your long sermons. As to the vegetables, look at your own plate. Mrs. Van Daan was beaten, well and truly beaten. She had taken a minute helping of vegetables herself. But she was not spoiled. Oh, no. Too many vegetables in the evening made her constipated. Why on earth does she keep her mouth shut about me? Then she wouldn't need to make such feeble excuses. It's gorgeous the way Mrs. Van Daan blushes. I don't. And that's just what she hates. Yours, Anne. I think I had one more I wanted to read to you guys. I'm just making sure what it is here. Yeah, this is it. Monday, September 28th, 1942. Dear Kitty, I had to stop yesterday long before I'd finished. I must tell you about another quarrel, but before I start on that, something else. Why do grown-ups quarrel so easily, so much, and over the most idiotic things? Up until now, I thought that only children squabbled, and that wore off as you grew up. Of course, there is sometimes a real reason for quarreling, but this is just plain bickering. I suppose I should get used to it, but I can't, nor do I think I shall, as long as I am the subject of nearly every discussion. They use the word discussion instead of quarrel. Nothing, I repeat, nothing about me is right. My general appearance, my character, my manners are discussed from A to Z. I am expected, by order, to simply swallow all the harsh words and shouts in silence, and I am not to use this. In fact, I can't. I'm not going to take all their insults lying down. I'll show them that Anne Frank wasn't born yesterday. Then they'll be surprised, and perhaps they'll keep their mouths shut when I let them see that I am going to start educating them. Shall I take up that attitude? Plain barbarism. I'm simply amazed again and again over the awful manners, and especially stupidity, Mrs. Van Daan's. But as soon as I get used to this, and it won't be long, then I'll give them so much of their own back and no half measures. Then they'll change their tune. Am I really so bad-mannered and conceited, headstrong, pushing, stupid, lazy, etc., as they all say? Oh, of course not. I have my faults just like anyone else. I know that. But they thoroughly exaggerate everything. Kitty, if only you knew how I sometimes boil under so many jibes and jeers. And I don't know how long I shall be able to stifle my rage. I shall just blow up one day. Still, no more of this. I've bored you long enough with all these quarrels, but I simply must tell you of one highly interesting discussion at table. Somehow or other, we got into the subject of Pim, Daddy's nickname, his extreme modesty. Even the most stupid people have to admit this about Daddy. Suddenly, Mrs. Van Daan said, I, too, have an unassuming nature, more so than my husband. Did you ever? This sentence itself shows quite clearly how thoroughly forward and pushing she is. Mr. Van Daan thought he ought to give an explanation regarding the reference to himself. I don't wish to be modest. In my experience, it does not pay. Then to me, take my advice, Anne. Don't be too unassuming. It doesn't get you anywhere. Mommy agreed with this too, but Mrs. Van Daan had to add, as always, her ideas on the subject. Her next remark was addressed to Mommy and Daddy. You have such a strange outlook on life. fancy saying such a thing to Anne. It was very different when I was young, and I feel sure that it still is, except in your modern home." This was a direct hit at the way Mummy was bringing up her daughters. Mrs. Van Daan was scarlet by this time, Mummy calm and cool as a cucumber. People who blush get so hot and excited. It's quite a handicap in such a situation. Mummy, still entirely unruffled, but anxious to close the conversation as soon as possible, thought for a second, and then said, "I find, too, Mrs. Van Daan, that one gets on better in life if one is not over-modest. My husband now, and Margot, and Peter are exceptionally modest, whereas your husband, Anne, you, and I, though are not exactly the opposite, don't allow ourselves to be completely pushed to one side." Mrs. Van Daan: "But, Mrs. Frank, I don't understand you. I am so very modest and retiring. How can you think of calling me anything else?" Mummy: "I didn't say you were exactly forward, but no one could say that you had a retiring disposition." Mrs. Van Daan: "Let me get this matter cleared up once and for all. I'd like to know in what way I am pushing. I know one thing. If I don't look after myself, I'd soon be starving." This absurd remark in self-defense was just made Mummy rock with laughter. That irritated Mrs. Van Daan, who added a string of German-Dutch-German expressions until she became completely tongue-tied, and then she rose from her chair and was about to leave the room. Suddenly her eye fell on me. You should have seen her. Unfortunately, at that very moment that she turned round, I was shaking my head sorrowfully, not on purpose, but quite involuntarily, for I had been following the whole conversation so closely. Mrs. Van Daan turned round and began to reel off a lot of harsh German, common, and ill-mannered, just like a coarse, red-faced fishwife. It was a marvelous sight. If I could draw, I'd have liked to have caught her in this. It was a scream, such a stupid, foolish little person. Anyhow, I've learned one thing now. You only really get to know people when you've had a jolly good row with them. Then, meaning when you've argued with them. You only really know people when you've argued with them. Then, and only then, can you judge their true character. Yours, Anne. Now, I'm sure there hasn't been any arguing or quarreling going on in your house right now. So go ahead and get your journal out, whether it's digital or on paper, and make sure that you take your time to write in it. And then today's Friday, so just a reminder that by Sunday night, you need to have all your journal entries turned in. If you've done it digitally, just go ahead and turn in the assignment. You can just hit the turn in button and turn the assignment in. If you've done it on paper, take a picture of all 4 of those pieces and either upload them to Classroom or email them to me. If you're emailing them, you may have to do them in more than one email. I don't know if if all the files will fit. So have a great weekend, and I will see you on Monday. Bye.